If as filmmakers we're all just laboriously trying to simulate the rush of texture and emotion you get from listening to great music, no one has ever come close to smacking the heart of a Tom Waits tune up there on screen than Jarmusch. Those are words from director Ryan Johnson on Jim Jarmusch's 1986 film, Down by Law. Seeing Faces in Movies, a podcast where each month I focus on the works of a different director or cinematographer, and each week I invite a guest on to discuss a film and the artist's filmography. I'm your host, Felicia, and we're talking Down by Law today. So, quick synopsis of the film is two men are framed and sent to jail where they meet a murderer who helps them escape and leave the state. Tagline for the film is, "It's not where you start, it's where you start again." The film stars Tom Waits as Zach, John Lurie as Jack, Roberto Benigni as Roberto, and Nicoletta Bracci as Nicoletta. It's written by Jim Jarmusch, cinematography by Robby Müller, directed by Jim Jarmusch, edited by Melody London, music by John Lurie, and costumes by Carol Wood. And quick fun fact, Claire Denis was the assistant director on this film. Today, my guests are Liam and Wayne from the In Film We Trust podcast. And it's a podcast I listen to quite a bit. They've covered a wide range of films that I highly recommend you check out. But before we get into the film today, which is Down by Law, I just want to thank you both for joining me today to discuss a Jarmusch film.
It's a pleasure being on here, Felicia. Thank you.
Oh, thank you. I'm interested to hear about how you formed this podcast, what inspired you to start it, and what the vision is for it.
Well, the funny thing is, like, me and Wayne grew up in this very tiny village in Scotland. I think the population is roughly 900. And funnily enough, through time, as you grow, as you age, you kind of fall apart from one another. He went to China, I was in Manchester, we kind of grew apart. And then, funnily enough, when he stopped teaching in China, which is what he was doing in China, he was teaching English over there, we kind of rekindled a friendship and we realized, fuck, man, we are both massively into film. And we would go on these long walks and, discuss and digress about cinema. I got to a point where I was like, dude, we should definitely just try a podcast, see what happens. It might not work out, it might work out, but I think it'll be a little fun exercise. And that's what we've been doing since about 2021, which is, I think, February 2021 was when our first episode, Kill List, dropped. And yeah, it is going strength from strength. And you said, what's our intention of this podcast? Well, we've always wanted to have guests of a diverse background, people we might not necessarily agree with, disagree with, whatever. We just want interesting stories, interesting guests, because there's a point where you go, okay, we all love cinema, and every film podcast you listen to, everybody loves cinema. But there's a point where you can be like, okay, we don't want to keep fanboying over stuff. So guests will come onto our show who don't necessarily have opinions that agree with us. And I think that makes it that much more interesting.
When I first found out about you guys, I tracked back and I've been kind of catching up to everything. So it's always been interesting to hear that it's not a specific type of film that you go for. Because I feel like at the beginning you were covering a lot of like kind of horror stuff. And some people might assume that, but no, you've covered like a wide range of stuff. And I always appreciate, even if I might not agree with some of your takes on the film, that's how it should be. Like you should want to hear other people's takes on film.
Our tagline is from the obscure to the mainstream. And that's what we set out to, cover films that, may not be necessarily popular. And, if we like a popular film, we discuss a popular film. If it's interesting to us, we hope it's interesting to the audience. And that's kind of where we started from. And we love discovering these kind of unsung gems, so to speak.
From the early days, we kind of decided we didn't want to be pigeonholed into just one genre, because I think horror is the one that occupies the most like specialized film podcasts. They choose the horror genre, but we wanted to cover a wide range of things. So we said, you know what, nothing's going to be off limits. We'll cover whatever. We'll cover little known films. We'll cover well known films. If it's interesting, if it gives us something to talk about, especially if we have different opinions or our listeners have different opinions, those are the best ones to go for, because it just demonstrates that film is subjective. Everybody has a lot to say about it. and that's what generates the most interesting conversations for us.
100%. I'm interested actually now to hear from both of you how it is that you started getting into watching films that were outside of just what was out at the time and going back and watching older films or films from genres you were not
Okay.
familiar with.
Okay, well, that kind of plays into this love of Jarmusch that I have. So obviously, growing up, I was like a football or soccer over in the United States fanatic, and I was a film fan, but you're watching films that you kind of you see advertised on the TV. I wasn't a precocious child or anything, so essentially, my very early film going experiences was literally just what was popular. And then as the teenage years rolled on, and you build your own identity, you kind of find yourself in those teenage years, those adolescent years. And that's where music comes into place. That's where, finding your own voice, so to speak, comes into play. And I think this parallels with you, actually, Felicia, as we've discussed privately, is you're a big fan of subculture, and not only contemporary subculture, but subculture going back.
Yeah.
So I was a big fan of like the 1960s, whether that's, more popular stuff like the Rolling Stones or slightly more obscure stuff like the bands The Seeds and, Dennis Hopper's Easy Rider. I'm a big Dennis Hopper fan. And then that would trail into, the Andy Warhol scene, Warhol superstars, which I loved, like Chelsea Girls, Paul Morrissey. And then pertinent to this film is the 1980s no wave scene, not the new wave scene, the no wave scene, which I thought very great because that is kind of artistically what I'm very much into. It's abrasive, it's dissonant, and it has all these kind of characteristics that Jim Jarmusch would have. And it's no coincidence that within that scene you had Eric Mitchell's film The Way It Is. Now, that film by Eric Mitchell starred Vincent Gallo and Steve Buscemi. Now, some people don't necessarily associate Steve Buscemi with the no wave scene, but he came out of this 80s New York scene. He co-starred with Vincent Gallo in that film. And this is the scene that Jim Jarmusch grew up in. Basquiat in Downtown 81, Glenn O'Brien, all these great filmmakers. And of course, we have to mention Nick Zed, who kind of popularized cinema of transgression in the early 1980s. All these kind of interesting filmmakers that kind of, they were conducive to this underground, independent American scene of the 1980s. And this is where Jarmusch came into play. And this is where I got into it because, as I said, subculture is important to me. I love, detouring into different aspects of, people's point of views. And as we said earlier, that's what our podcast is all about, different point of views. Don't have to agree or disagree. It's just what it is. It's fascinating to find out about people. And that's how I got into Jarmusch, that interest in the subculture. And Jarmusch, for a large part of his career, I know it's became more fashionable in the 2000s to think of him as, the quote unquote hipster director. Yeah. But he was very underground in the 80s, part of the 90s. And, that interests me.
How about you, Wayne?
Well, with me getting into film, one of my earliest memories of actually watching a movie was when I went to see Toy Story in the cinema, which I believe is about 1995. That was the first film I saw in the cinema. I loved that. Not long afterwards, a friend of mine moved house and they got rid of a bunch of VHS tapes. And one of them was Terminator 2. Right. And I remember watching that. And I think it might be kind of cliche, but I think of all the films I've ever seen, that was the one that really kicked off my interest in cinema. Mm-hmm. I went on from that and I watched Aliens. And then, as Liam was saying, you watch a lot of stuff that's popular at the time. We didn't have a lot of channels on the TV. We never had Sky like a lot of people at school did. So I just kind of watched whatever there was. And I watched other films like Blazing Saddles, Smokey and the Bandit, kind of my parents' films. And growing up, I didn't really follow any specific directors. I didn't really follow any specific movements. I just kind of went by what sounded interesting. Okay, this film sounds interesting. I've seen a trailer for this. Maybe I'll watch this. And as I've grown up, I've kind of bounced all over the place. I'll go through phases where I'll watch films which are deemed essential. I'll go through phases where I'll watch films deemed controversial, which played into our Video Nasty Month, which we did a while ago.
Yep.
So I would just kind of bounce back and forward and watch whatever I thought was interesting. If I liked it, great. If I didn't, great. If it gave me something to talk about, something to shoot the shit about, that's what I really enjoyed. And I have, I'd say, a very eclectic range of films I really enjoy by a various range of directors. I just kind of went with what looked interesting to me, what sounded interesting to me, anything that gave me something to talk about it afterwards.
And I think that's what's been appealing to a lot of people for our podcast is people might not gather, maybe from the podcast, I'm not sure, that me and Wayne have very different views on the film and different tastes in film. So we're constantly engaging with one another and introducing one another to different films that we possibly otherwise wouldn't have watched.
I think that's cool. That's what I miss about my own podcast and not having like a regular co-host of just having kind of, your own personalities and your own views. So I do enjoy when I listen to podcasts like yours or other friends' podcasts where it's like the two of them. Occasionally they'll have guests on, but it's mainly the two of them. And you can always kind of tell this person's going to like this movie or they're not going to like this film, but it's still a good discussion.
Makes it especially interesting when I'm watching a film. Let's say it's a film Liam selected, because we go back and forth on the films we select. Like he'll select one week, I'll select one another week, unless it's guests, in which case they usually choose them. But I like watching it and thinking, I understand why Liam made me watch this, or I understand maybe I like this element, he doesn't, vice versa, because that gives us something to talk about. That gives us something to discuss and decipher when we're actually recording the podcast itself.
Which I think is great. I think it makes for, a great podcast. And there's so many film podcasts out there, obviously. So you got to make it worth people's time to actually listen to an hour and a half of you speaking.
I know this is episode 4 of your Jim Jarmusch season here, Felicia, and I don't know if you've already expressed this, but I want to turn the tables on you. What got you into Jim Jarmusch?
I can't even remember how it is that I found out about him. I assume it was think I started watching him just before I entered film school. And at that point, I was trying to watch the stuff that is on certain lists or whatnot. But I was also a huge, as like a young teenager, like 13-year-old, a huge Johnny Depp fan. So I'd watch Dead Man. So
great film.
Actually, maybe Dead Man was the first one I'd watched. And then I went back to Stranger in Paradise. So I watched Dead Man because Johnny Depp was in it. And I always say there's certain actors or certain directors who are huge, but they will get you into the smaller stuff because of who they've worked with. So Johnny Depp is a person that got me into a lot of different directors that I probably wouldn't have gotten into that early in my life. So because I liked Dead Man and looked to see who directed it, then I was like, okay, let me go back. I watched Stranger in Paradise, loved it. Then I watched Down by Law, and that solidified it for me, where I was like, okay, this is one of my people right here. Like, I love everything. And I've watched every single thing he's liked. And as I said before we started the actual recording, like, I've loved everything. There's things I like more than others, but I haven't disliked anything, and I respect any changes in his career that he's done or any new explorations that he's done.
It's funny that you mention his newest one, because the last Jim Jarmusch film, the latest one that he had out that I seen, was The Dead Don't Die, which I believe was from 2019. And I didn't come to that film because it's a Jarmusch film, you need to watch this, he's a great director, because my wife is a hardcore Adam Driver fan. She will watch absolutely everything he's been in. In fact, I think she probably has, actually. And she's seen that he was in this. I think he was also in Patterson, which Jarmusch did before. She really wanted to see The Dead Don't Die. I watched it. I had kind of mixed feelings on it because I went back and, like I say, we said before we recorded, I write reviews for new films I've seen, and I went back and read the review. From what I read, the thing I liked most about it was Tilda Swinton's performance, because she plays like this eccentric Scottish woman, which I thought was absolutely hilarious. But other than that, there wasn't a ton in it that I enjoyed. I mean, I enjoyed the interplay between Bill Murray and Adam Driver. That was quite good. I wasn't overall impressed with it. So Down by Law, that's the second Jarmusch film I've actually watched. So I'm coming to this from a kind of different perspective than you guys are. So I'm kind of the counterpoint to you two.
I love that.
That's only the second one.
Well, that kind of leads into my next question before we actually get into the film. I don't know, Wayne, did you watch this for the first time, Down by Law?
Yeah, this was the first time I'd watched it for this thing, yeah.
I guess I'll pass it off to Liam first because he's seen it before.
Oh, okay.
And then Wayne will get into your thoughts because it's your first time. But I'm interested, Liam, to hear what your first thoughts were.
We have to break him in gently, Felicia.
No, I mean, even if you didn't like it, I'm still interested to hear what you thought. But Liam, for someone who has seen it, do you remember what your thoughts were on the first time because we'll get into how you thought
Okay.
about it on this watch.
No, I absolutely loved it the first time. But this film, look, this film was catnip to me because I was saying these formative years. I was a big John Lurie fan before I even
hmm
knew, a Jim Jarmusch directed film. I was a huge Lone Lizards guy. Tom Waits, I was a big Tom Waits guy. This is what I like about, the Jim Jarmusch's films. This dissonance is what I'm talking about. And I don't know if our listeners here have ever heard of John Lurie's band, the Lone Lizards, but they take this jazz approach and then they almost make it atonal. And this is like sacrament to the whole no wave scene, is this dissonance. I'm using that word again. I know that's about the third time I've used it. And I think Jim Jarmusch is plumbing that same well, this kind of dissonant, atonal type of filmmaking where offhand it kind of feels aloof, but it's very confrontational in its own way. And yeah, when I watched Jim Jarmusch's Down by Law for the first time, loved it because it had all the ingredients I liked. I don't think I had ever seen a Benigni film before. I think this was the first Benigni film I had ever seen. And yeah,
I think most audiences
Yeah.
outside of Italy, it probably was our first time seeing him, to be honest.
yeah, and it worked for me. The aesthetic and everything, I just loved.
Keep on to that sentiment about Benigni because
Yeah.
I know he's a major talking point. But Wayne, I'm actually curious before I know we keep pushing it. I do want to talk about the film, but we are kind of talking
That's
about
right.
the film. But Wayne, I'm curious, were you aware of Jarmusch and just hadn't gotten around to it? Were you maybe not interested? And no judgment, I'm just curious.
No, the word aware is very appropriate. Yeah, I was aware of Jim Jarmusch. He wasn't one of those directors that pops up on my radar a lot. I'm not saying I'm just into mainstream directors,
Mhm.
but he was a guy who he was kind of almost on the periphery of my thoughts. I'd heard a lot of his films, like Permanent Vacation was another one. Coffee and Cigarettes was one I remember reading about, but I'd never actually watched one of his films till I did Dead Don't Die. So yeah, Down by Law was my second Jarmusch film that I'd seen, and I really enjoyed it. In the first like 5-10 minutes, you know how I've heard people say they'll check out of a movie if the first 10 minutes doesn't grab them. Well, the first 10 minutes of this did grab me because straight away I could feel how different it was to a conventional film. You have that panning shot across the streets, you have that score in the background, it's in beautiful black and white. That feeling of a film that's not necessarily trying to tell like a 3-act story, it's trying to create a mood, it's creating a vibe, it's trying to kind of paint a snapshot of a certain time and place. That's what I liked so much about it. I can see that can actually put some people off, people who are looking for more convention maybe in their storytelling. But Jarmusch, from what I've seen and what I've heard, he kind of does away with convention. He very much does his own thing.
Can I just expand on that, Wayne? You mentioned you've seen Permanent Vacation before, and I want to give credit to the more little known filmmakers here because I mentioned earlier the Eric Mitchell, the director of The Way It Is. He also is in that film, Permanent Vacation, Jim Jarmusch's first film. I believe he's the guy who is selling the stolen car.
Is he?
Now,
Okay.
quite an esteemed filmmaker in the no wave scene. He also made The Foreigner, starring, Debbie Harry from Blondie. So I think that's a fun little anecdote there.
Oh, okay. I haven't seen that one yet.
Oh, it's quite interesting. Yeah, so listeners, check out Eric Mitchell's film.
There you go. That's a good recommendation. Well, Wayne, you kind of already segued into my first point of the film we're talking about because I'm a huge, huge, huge Robby Müller fan who's the cinematographer for this film. He did cinematography for a lot of Jarmusch films, a lot of Wim Wenders films, a lot of Lars von Trier films, but this is the first collaboration for them. And as much as this is a series about Jarmusch, it would be remiss for me to not mention how beautiful this film looks, especially if you've watched
Looks great.
the Criterion release of it, which I'm sure we all watched was the Criterion release of it.
That was the one that we watched, yeah.
It's just absolutely gorgeous. His photography of Louisiana, of New Orleans, a place I've never been in the States yet, but I've always wanted to go. It just looks so different from Canada. I'm sure it looks so different from Scotland as well, but a lot of us are somewhat familiar what New Orleans is like, and his cinematography is beautiful. The black and white, I think, lends so well to this story as well. I'm curious or understand how you feel about just the visuals before we get into the story of this film.
Yeah, I love the visuals. And it's funny you say you've never been to Louisiana because Jim Jarmusch had never been to Louisiana himself. He based his whole aesthetic on this film on reading Tennessee Williams plays, scripts, etc., etc. So yeah, he was building up from this whole idea he built in his head without even being there. And you said the aesthetic of this film. Yeah, a weird comparison I'm going going to make, and it may not seem obvious. I don't even know if it's true, but it seemed true when I thought of it, was David Lynch. Now, David Lynch has this love of the industrial America, these industrious heartlands. And this film seems to be kind of in the same wavelength because it's, as you said, it's beautifully shot. It's not necessarily showing the beauty of Louisiana. It's juxtaposing the beauty of the landscape and the ruin of man, you know, the buildings, the shantytown type places. So it kind of is plumbing that same, another weird reference, Eraserhead, you know, where Eraserhead had this kind of nightmarish atmosphere. And I'm not saying this film has a nightmarish atmosphere, but it's juxtaposing natural beauty versus, you know, man-made decay, I'd say.
That's an interesting comparison because I think they're somewhat similar, David Lynch and Robby Müller, because I'm going to attribute this to Müller, who has done, like, I don't know, what his most popular thing might be Paris, Texas. And then all the Jarmusch films and the vendor stuff that he did. But he's Dutch, is not that familiar with America, especially small town America. It's, you know, whatever. You come to America, you go to California, you go to New York. You're not necessarily going to places elsewhere. So he's filming it as an outsider view. But I think what you said, like, he's not trying to make it more beautiful than it is, but he's also not trying to make it more ugly. He's just painting it exactly the way it is. And I think that's always been his strength, where he can find beauty in things that necessarily aren't beautiful, but you kind of have an appreciation for, being like, this is just regular life that people live. And I love that. And Jarmusch is very much, that's his thing. He loves just painting the lives of regular human beings. And I think everyone in this film is just a regular human being, despite the fact that their circumstances might seem weird, or the adventure they were on seems weird, but they're regular human beings.
One of the interesting things with Robby Müller on this film is Jarmusch actually gave Robby Müller carte blanche to shoot this film however which way he wanted. The only prerequisite was he said, look, this film is a fairy tale. That was it. Shoot it however you want, but this film is a fairy tale.
Something I really liked about it, and this is kind of a credit to Müller, and also really emphasized something about black and white cinematography that I've never really thought about before, of how it helps to emphasize light and dark as well. So like when you have the glare of the sun on someone, how much more emphasized it is, or when there's shadows, for example, in some of the scenes in the prison in the film, how the darkness looks so much more vivid. So I love that. And I love how, like you say, Felicia, it wasn't trying to make everything look more beautiful or more ugly. It was like trying to bring out the realism, tried to bring out the depth in like all of the images.
This is actually one of the first Criterions I ever bought, was Down by Law. I remember when I first got into Criterion, I think it was like Down by Law, I bought Videodrome and like Harold and Maude, probably in the same combo there.
That's a great trio.
Yeah, but Down by Law was one of the first, and it just was like an automatic, like, obviously I need to own Down by Law because I love it. And rewatching it, it just really solidified how much I love it. But it's funny that you mentioned, you know, he'd never been to Louisiana and never experienced the culture there or seen what it really looked like.
Yeah.
It was the same with in Mystery Train. He'd never been to Memphis. He just like, I really want to write a story about Memphis. He had obviously shot it there, but he had never been there before. They actually gone to shot. As all of us, all three of us, are outsiders to America and Louisiana, they don't really automatically tell us where it's set. I think that if you know anything about that area, you would know right off the bat, or as the story goes on, or just kind of the vibe. Yeah. How do you feel, as all of us being outsiders, how he introduced the fact that where it's set, that it starts off in New Orleans, but then, you know, it's probably a city outside of New Orleans, in the state of Louisiana, where the prison is, and they're traveling through the state to get to closer to elsewhere,
possibly Texas.
Exactly. But for me, I because I'd seen it before, I knew where it was set, but I specifically paid attention to this time where I was like, oh, they don't actually explicitly mention that it's that, other than on their uniform, prison uniform, it says. So how do you feel about the way they set up the setting? Because I think the state of Louisiana, New Orleans, is very important without being explicitly said.
Yeah. Well, it's important you say that you're not quite sure where it's set. I would expand on that. You're also not necessarily sure what decade it is set in. If you look at the kind of, you know, the falsified personas of Tom Waits and John Lurie, like Tom Waits is harkening back to the beatnik era. John Lurie in the Lounge Lizards is also playing this jazz music, which you could link back to the 50s, the 40s. So we're also in this film playing with time, because there's a point in this film where there's a scene where they take on somebody else's clothes, and when they dress in these people's clothes, it almost looks like the clothes they're wearing at the start of the film anyway. So the fashion, the aesthetic, the visuals, and importantly the black and white. I don't know if it was a budgetary thing or whatever, why they're filming in black and white, but it's harkening back to a previous era. This reminds me, the work of Jack Kerouac, William Burroughs, Allen Ginsberg. It's very plumbing that kind of 50s underground aesthetic of the beatniks. What do you think? Did you think it was kind of out of time almost? I still don't even know if it is that. What decade is this film set in?
I think it's set in the actual decade it's filmed in.
You think it's
But I
present
think
time?
that Jarmusch just loves other decades. But you go ahead.
What I tend to do is, if I'm watching a film, if I can't really tell when it's meant to be set, I look at the cars.
Mhm.
That's usually how I judge it. I'm like, oh, it's that kind of style, that kind of setup. But I think this whole idea of not being sure where it's set, not being sure when it's set, it gives this kind of universality, because the idea is these kind of characters, you could maybe have found these kind of people anywhere. You can see yourselves in these people. So it doesn't even really matter. I mean, you see them later on, they're like on the swamps, like in the bayou, but they could have been it could have been anybody from anywhere, and it gives it that universal appeal.
Yeah. I mean, I think with this, especially setting it in not, a big city like New York, where his previous films had been set, a lot of us as a North American think of the southern states as being behind. That's not even true, but a lot of us think of that. So I think he's playing on that too, where we assume that they're behind in times, where they're stuck in an era that we're past, but it's just that they're living that era in a different way, right? I think that's exactly what's happening there. And we see someone like the John Lurie who looks like could be in a noir film, but then Tom Waits kind of looks like this beatnik punk character.
Yeah.
And then Benigni is just, an Italian who's just coming,
Benigni.
he's coming,
He's
he's doing
Benigni,
his
right?
own thing. So I love that, but I love he's taking, the jazz influence of New Orleans, Louisiana. That's what they're known for. And just like the visuals, there's certain shots of like buildings. Specifically, there's one when Tom Waits gets all his stuff thrown out of the apartment and he's sitting on the curb, and we see this like kind of
I've got
building.
something to say about
It's
that.
so beautiful, where I'm just like, I've always wanted to go to New Orleans. It's always been like a dream of mine to go there. And that watching this, I was like, okay, I really need to book a ticket. And just like shooting those specific locations and not explicitly saying this is where it is, but knowing that people know enough about that area, I think is really special and really smart of them to do.
Now you mentioned that scene, and we have to discuss that scene, Felicia, because in Pulp Fiction, where John Travolta says you never mess with another man's automobile, well, you never mess with another man's record collection. I mean, I collect records. You do not throw somebody's record collection out the window. I'm sorry. There's many trespasses we can trespass in life. You can't be flinging records like they're frisbees out the window.
Yeah, I mean, I also collect records, sorry, and have been and like looking over. I have a bunch there, and just been like, sometimes I can see what era of my life that I was in where I was collecting these, and I think I would not have been as calm as Tom Waits' character in this.
It's like Wayne asked me, he's like, look, after he watched this, he's like, has Tom Waits ever been a DJ? I was like, no, I don't think he was a DJ. He was just a musician, because in this film, he is playing a DJ, and there's a scene, of course, when they're in jail, and John Lurie is saying to him, you're on the radio, recite something, tell me the weather forecast, for example. He has a great radio voice. Tom Waits is a singular character. I know it's a persona. I know it's all purpose built. I know he's not like that in real life, but I like to believe the fantasy that Tom Waits is Tom Waits, if you know what I mean.
Well, I was watching an interview with Tom Waits from, I think it was 1979. It was on Australian TV. And obviously he's got that great voice. I think someone said Tom Waits' voice sounds like it was soaked in like a bourbon casket and then it was run over by a car.
Yeah.
like how he sounds like that in real life. Also, his mannerisms as well, because on screen in this film, he plays a guy who seems very insular. He rarely looks people in the eye. He's always turning away. He's kind of got his hands up against himself like this. Like he's a very insular, insecure character. He was like that in the interview as well. He's like someone who's almost not that comfortable being looked at. Maybe that's why they had his character as a DJ, because it makes sense. He has a voice for radio, but he's got the mannerisms of someone who's not entirely comfortable in his own skin.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I think I like the persona of Tom Waits. And he also played, for anyone listening who's seen Mystery Train, there's like a running radio stream that goes through all 3 segments, and he's the voice of that radio DJ in there. So it was just Jarmusch using him again. But they have a long-standing relationship. And
but in this film, you're right. We have essentially the 2 straight men. You have John Lurie, Tom Waits, and they're kind of playing their self in a way. They both have that detached, aloof, New York coolness type of vibe. John Lurie has cultivated this image also, where he's very confrontational in his way. If you ask him a question, he's one of them who'll look into the sky for 10 minutes before he gives you an answer. And they've kind of cultivated this persona, and they're kind of Jim Jarmusch is cleverly cast them to their personas. And that's why I think, Roberto Benigni in this film, he actually makes this film better. Because prior to him entering this film, and I'm a huge, as I said, John Lurie fan, Tom Waits fan, but they're plumbing the same depths, John Lurie and Tom Waits, in the characterizations they're playing. So it takes this, he is playing the foreigner, and Jim Jarmusch is purposely using this trope as the foreigner as the comic relief. I mean, there's no 2 ways about it. He's using that trope. But what's interesting is when Roberto Benigni comes into this film, he makes it that much better by being able to play against, the aloof Tom Waits and John Lurie.
Well, the whole idea with Roberto Benigni in this film is he speaks English, but broken English, because Roberto Benigni, of course, is Italian. And one of my pet hates in films is trying to find a good way of dealing with the language barrier, because a lot of films do it so badly. But I like how this film did it, because what does Bob do? He writes down like English idioms. At one point, he looks, he's like, "There's no room in this building to swing a cat," things like this, which is what you imagine he would do. He struggles to put sentences together. Crucially, something I like, when he's on his own, he talks to himself in his native language. How many times have you seen films where people don't speak English, they'll speak that language to other people who speak their native language? Like, why are you speaking English to each other? And yeah, I think with Bob, he does make the film a lot better, because he is kind of the hero in this. He's kind of the best character, actually. I think he was the one I found most interesting. There's a lot of abrasiveness from the other 2 guys. It's a very interesting dynamic between the 3 of them. Something I loved about this is the film has, I guess you could call them kind of twists, which were quite obvious, but told you a lot about the character. For example, Jack at the start, he's sent off to this hotel room to see this girl. I said to myself, this is going to be a setup. And then when Zach is given the job of driving the car across town, I thought, it's not his car. He's been drinking. He's going to get pulled over by the cops. Then when they initiate the jailbreak, I thought, these 3 men are going to turn on each other in no time. That happens. But it didn't feel like a failure of storytelling. It felt like it told you a lot about their characters, whether they're impulsive or whether they're desperate or whether they're kind of naive. It told you a lot about them because you could see these things coming.
It's interesting because there was this era of Benigni where this was his first American film, and Jarmusch and him had met at a film festival. I can't remember which one it was. It was somewhere in Europe. I feel like it was the Venice Film Festival, but correct me if I'm wrong, listeners. And, they met. Benigni did not speak English, but Jarmusch loved his vibe, and he was a huge comedian in Italy. He was very well known there at that point. He wrote this role specifically for him. He's coming over to America for the very first time. He's never stepped foot on this continent before. Did not speak English, but he learned to speak English through like the certain phrases through this film. And he kept that notebook of, English sayings, and Jarmusch was like, I'm going to put this into this film for that and this character. And I think people have turned on him post, him winning the Oscar for Life is Beautiful and his Pinocchio stuff. I still like him. I think he's great. People have turned on him. Maybe there'll be a resurgence later on in life, but people thought he was annoying. But I think he works so well in this film because you got 2 very American men who are kind of abrasive, and they're always fighting, and he's the inter person in this trio of people. And I think he adds such a levity, which is brings to the next point that I want to talk about. Just sort of, there's a lot of quiet moments in this film. It's kind of quiet. It's very dialogue driven, but there's a lot of quiet moments where they're just kind of sitting in jail, waiting for something to happen, sitting to figure out what's going to happen.
Yeah.
Are we going to be able to use this boat? How do we go where we're going? But there's in moments of levity and comedy, and I think that's what Jarmusch does a lot. Benigni is that in this film. How do you feel about that? Being kind of comedic relief.
I think it absolutely works. As I was saying, look, they're essentially playing the straight guy, Lurie and Waits, and then when they meet in this prison cell, it's like, okay, if you have two guys playing essentially a similar role, you can't sustain that over an hour 45 or whatever this film is. So the injection of Benigni, this fish out of water story, and this is what I was saying, it's essentially the Foreigner as comic relief. But Jim Jarmusch, of course, he's more intelligent now. It's not like going back to, the Carry On days in the United Kingdom. He's got more intelligence as that. So he subverts that trope, so to speak. And essentially, as much as we want to say, look, this is John Lurie, this is Tom Waits' film, it is really Benigni's film. He is the warmth to the film. It's the character you feel the most warmth to. And it's also the character who incites the most action. And not only does he incite the most action, he essentially has the most complete character arc of the entire film.
Mm-hmm.
So he is pretty much the most important character. And yes, we're using, fish out of water. We're using this as humor. We're using the language barrier as humor, the writing down on a notepad as humor. And I mean, every time I have ice cream to this day, it's always stuck in my head. You scream, we scream, we all scream for ice cream to this bloody day. And it has been, I don't know when the last time I saw it was. Maybe 20 years ago was the first time I saw it. But of course, I've seen it in the intermediate years. It's always stuck in my head. When you get an intelligent director like a Jarmusch and they subvert certain tropes that possibly in let's say even a decade prior to this film in the 1970s could be, obnoxious, insensitive, it becomes something else when you're subverting the ideas. And as I said, Benigni's the heartbeat of this film in my eyes. And it's not too much.
And the thing is, he plays the role with such earnesty and such passion and conviction. This could easily have been a very stereotypical role, but you look at his role in the film, he's basically the best of them. I mean, the funny thing is, he turns out to be the only one guilty of a crime that's put him in jail. But, he's the one that springs them out. He's the one that gets them food. He's basically the one that keeps them going. It got to a point where I was almost actually physically angry when at the end when they send him into the diner, like, yeah, you're going to take the guy who sprung you out of prison and you're going to send him into this potentially dangerous situation, because let's be honest, they are kind of taking advantage of him, the fact he's kind of naive and kind of easily pushed around, but he is the hero of the story. He is the better man of the three.
I agree. He's also my favorite, and I love his character arc. I love the fact that one, he's not just playing a stereotype. I know post that there's been a lot of Italian stereotypes in American cinema. And as someone who's half Italian, sometimes it hurts to watch that. But I think as someone, he is an Italian and this is just who he is. He's not putting on an exaggerated accent. This is how he speaks in English. And that's just his personality of wanting to be friendly. He just wants to keep the peace and he wants to speak as he gets them to at least accept each other's company, especially the other two, because they're always trying to fight and they get into two big physical fights within this film. But Roberto gets the best ending out of the three, because the other two, we have no idea what's going to happen to them. They're going to walk off into their distance. They go within that fork, they go east and west because they don't want to be anywhere near each other. Roberto gets love, and it's played by his actual wife, Nicoletta, who's a big person.
Is that his wife? I never knew that.
She's in a couple other Jarmusch films too, but they're actually married in real life too. Okay. So it's always nice to see them still married. But yeah, it's nice to see what happens to that character, and he really is the glue to this trio, because essentially at the end of the day, this film is about the characters more so than the plot.
He is the glue that holds them together. And importantly, you think everybody's getting a happy end and everybody's escaped from jail. You got Bob, Jack, Zach. They've all escaped from prison. But Benigni, he finds love, as you said, and then you have the fork in the crossroads, and you're like, okay, And that even at that moment, they can't find common ground. And I think that's what we're all pertaining to. It's because Bob's gone.
Yeah.
Bob's no longer there to hold them together. So they have to go their separate ways. And it's, it's very much that Johnson's song, Devil in the Crossroads type of situation where one wants to go West Coast, wants to go East Coast. They don't necessarily know what direction to go. All they know is they want to go separate from each other. And this kind of pertains to something earlier is in the film is they're going to leave Bob when they escape from the prison. And can I just interject? Because I think it is quite fascinating. When they escape from prison, we don't actually know how they escape from prison. They run into the yard and then they're in the sewerage system. And there's almost this like magical realism aspect where it's like, okay, we don't necessarily need to know. All we need to know is they escaped. And that's kind of good enough. They escaped, they're away, they go into the swamps of Louisiana. They can swim, Bob can't. They're going to leave Bob. Their conscience, I think, kicks in. They stay with Bob. And we have this kind of nice little moment. It's like, okay, these are quasi pieces of shit. You have Lourie playing a pimp, essentially. There's goodness in everybody. And I think that's kind of what's plumbing, but it doesn't necessarily mean it traverses everything.
Yeah.
The way that this film is structured, we talk about the prison break thing, you often get the feeling that very little was actually left out because you see them breaking out the prison next to the river, then the cooking the food, you see them going up the river, because the film is done in this very unhurried manner, because this is a very high pressure situation where every event would seem significant. Every tiny little detail would be a big deal. And I think that really leans well into the comedy of the film, because Felicia, you were saying before, it can be quite a funny film. I think that's because of how it's paced and how a lot of it is just people shooting the shit, just talking away. So the funny moments really catch you off guard. I think the one I like the most is when they have to get off the river and they go into a little cabin which has bunk beds in it, and it's filmed exactly the way the prison was. I burst out laughing. I thought, you've broken out of a big prison to essentially end up stuck in a smaller one. Like, how unfortunate is that?
Well, you mentioned the pacing there, Wade, and this film is kind of very episodic. It's like each sequence essentially survives as its own three-act structure, something Jarmusch would explore later in Night on Earth, which I don't know if you're doing that for this series, but I think Night on Earth is one of his greatest films.
I love it.
It's a great film, right? But this film is essentially, 10 three-act structures, 10 short stories, very episodic, but all joint together. And it kind of works for me. And you mentioned about earlier in this episode, the Jarmusch characteristics. This film starts off, okay, with, or near the start, starts off with Tom Waits' character. And this is important to Jarmusch, I believe, and Müller, and it's made a very much a point of this film because when Tom Waits is leaning into his lovers, or his, I'm not sure whose house that is where those records are thrown out, but he leans in the doorway, and on the doorway is scribbled two sentences or two phrases. It's not the fall that kills you, it's the sudden stop. And the other one on the wall was scribbled, life is a limbo dance, but it's a question of where you get down, not how long you get. And doesn't those two sentences, as contradictory as they seem or as skewered as they seem, not sum up Jim Jarmusch's approach to
That's exactly why I love his work. It's exactly that.
It's a skewering of reality. It's the upending of reality. Look at this, restaging it so it feels like a simulacrum of real life, but you're like, there's something slightly off.
I think that's exactly what follows through with all of his films, where it's like he's portraying real human beings, but there's always like that one element where you're like, this wouldn't happen this way, but you accept it in this film because you're like, well, at the end of the day, I'm watching a film and it's a story he's telling. And you can accept it because it's not, a huge fantasy, but you kind of want it for those characters to happen. Like you want them to get out of jail because they're not evil human beings. They're just human beings that have gotten themselves in a bad way. And you hope for them, but it doesn't matter how they got out of jail. It just matters what they do after that. Right. And I think that's the basis of this whole story.
I think as well, it kind of demonstrates the contradictions in human nature, especially when you end up in a situation you didn't expect. For example, at the start, Jack is talking to this woman in his apartment and she's talking about something and he chastises her basically for talking too much. Then later on, when Jack is in the prison cell with Zach, he chastises Zach for not talking enough. It's like Jack didn't expect to be in this situation, but this has kind of brought his side out. And they've obviously didn't expect to be in this trio. And they've ended up doing things which are maybe outside of their normal nature, but you believe it because this is out of their wheelhouse. This is outside of their comfort zone. So you would act differently in this situation if you were in it yourself.
I love that Jarmusch loves to kind of portray the mundanity of life, but he manages to make it very interesting, which I think is his best skill, amongst other things. But it's very difficult for you to just portray a regular human day. Like if we were to put our lives on film, we could film it. A lot of people do on social media. They film their lives on film, but certain people can make it interesting. And what's the reason why? And he's tapped into something that's made it so that we keep watching his films over decades.
Well, here's a question for you, Felicia. I know as a youngster you liked photography, and you got into this is why your podcast explores cinematographers as much as directors. So I'm curious of you, okay? We're used to this 24 frames per second. We're used to a certain amount of cuts per film, and Jarmusch is slowing that very much down. And as you said, it feels like reality, but it's a skewering of reality. So what is it cinematography wise that when we see an image, displayed for X amount of time, a shot longer than we would usually see in a specific film, why does it take on a new stratosphere? Why does it become something else that we're not used to?
I think it makes us actually think about what we're watching as opposed to viewing it on a surface level. We're kind of being like, okay, now I'm in this. And sometimes things, even especially with Robby Müller stuff or Jarmusch, they make you sit in a situation longer than you're used to, longer than you even necessarily want to be in. Because there's certain shots where they're just sitting there, they're playing cards or they're in jail. There's nothing being said, and you're like, okay, this could have been a minute long, but it's 3 minutes long. And you're sitting there, you're like, okay, when are we going to get to either someone saying something or the next scene? But I think having you sit there makes you feel that this is a reality for people, and these are real people that we're watching. Personally, I feel like a lot of Canadian cinema, which a lot of people are not familiar with, is like that. That's what I'm used to, of just long periods of nothing and sadness happening in films.
What, did we not see that in Strange Brew?
Not in Strange Brew, no, not in the comedies, but the other, especially French Canadian stuff from Quebec, is a lot of like long shots of like just showing how dark and depressing Canada can be for most of the year because it's winter.
Did you notice in this film as well? I think it's Jim Jarmusch's formative years that, that no wave dissonance, so to speak. There's many shots in this film where somebody will enter a room, or the way this film is edited or cut together, it's very much a distraction. So as we would typically see, the scene would cut when somebody enters the room, but this cuts to the door, then 2 seconds later, somebody enters the door. And this is what I say, it's this Jim Jarmusch abrasiveness, it's his confrontational aspect. It's kind of jarring and off-putting, and it kind of sets you off kilter, so to speak. It's very discomforting. And I know they're probably not words one would associate with Jim Jarmusch, but his films are very jarring if you look into the minutiae of the detail, because the way they're cut, they're either ahead 3 seconds or they're behind 3 seconds. And it's not typically something you see in cinema.
Yeah. I think that's something he's carried throughout his career. Even going as far as maybe not even in The Dead Don't Die, but I think more so in something like Patterson, a more modern one, where we're just watching a guy who drives a bus and he writes poetry and he's living his day-to-day life and he does the exact same thing 7 days a week. To most people that would be boring, but there's something in the way that he shows it to show that, hey, your life is not boring. You're just not looking at it necessarily the correct way, or you're not looking at it. It's not that I don't even know. Maybe Jarmusch is an optimist in that way, where he realizes human lives, regular lives, can be interesting, and we shouldn't all aspire to have this huge glamorous life, because just your regular day-to-day life is important, and those little details, the interest that you have, should be highlighted and celebrated. And I think that's what he does in the characters that he shows, where he's like, someone could want to be a radio DJ and they have done it, haven't succeeded, but they want to continue doing it. And that's interesting, right?
I agree with you. I absolutely loved Patterson when I first seen it. Stars Adam Driver, and is it Farhini? Farhini, I believe the actress is called. Yeah, and you could argue that that's his most comforting film, because it's, in a sense, very meditative. And, he's this poet, he drives a bus. We have a structure, we have a routine, and it's kind of this Buddhist, or should we throw out, the whole Twitter geeks type thing? We have the whole, True Detective flat circle thing. Everything that happens will happen again and again.
Yeah.
In a sense, that is what is happening in Patterson, and it's so meditative and it's so hypnotic, that film. You can't help but love it. I always find it funny, when Jim Jarmusch was asked, when he worked with Adam Driver, he's like, "Oh, what did you think of, Adam Driver as, whoever he played in Star Wars?" He was like, "What?" He says, "I've never seen a Star Wars film in my life."
Kylo Ren, yeah. Kylo Ren, yeah. I think having it about the characters that Jarmusch focus on makes them more relatable, because you think of the characters in this film, you've got one guy who is basically, he's like a guy who's just thrown in jail for, it was like a manslaughter charge. You've got a failed DJ, and you've got kind of a wannabe pimp. So you've got the more down-to-earth characters than like Kylo Ren, who was this guy that wanted to like conquer the galaxy, for example. So while you might enjoy that kind of thing, and I know a lot of people do, but the fact is, by focusing on these more small scale, these kind of more intimate characters, it's a lot more interesting. And you see when that kind of thin slice of life, just them playing a game of cards, just them having a little song in the prison thing, for example, that brings out the most interesting aspects of human nature. And obviously that's what Jarmusch is the most interested in.
There's such a lot of great moments between them that seem so real to those characters, even down to when the Jack and Zach are at the very end, because we see them at the end and they're realizing, hey, I think that jacket is more suited to me. Let's swap it. And I think that's one of my favorite endings in cinema. I just love them just be like, let's swap this and then never speak again. This is more me, this is more you. We know each other now well enough to know that, but let's never speak after that.
I like the fact it's not wrapping the movie up in a neat little bow. It's not, oh, I respect you, thanks for what we've been through. It's kind of, we went through this together, but I don't really like you. I'm never going to like you. So let's just go our separate ways. Because that's what it's like in life. There's plenty of people you'll meet who you've no interest in seeing again. You just didn't get on with them. Maybe there was an abrasive attitude there that you didn't like very much. But the fact that you've been through something together is kind of important. It's more important than, the journey is more important than the destination, as people often say.
Would you class this as a road movie?
I was thinking about that.
Yeah, you kind of
because when I was thinking about one of the last two questions I'll ask you in this, I was thinking about road movies. Would I pair this with another road film? And I think it is. I think a lot of people think road films, they involve a car, but I think it's just more so a journey that people are on. So I would consider this a road movie, a buddy movie for sure.
It's literally a road movie. And it parallels with Stranger Than Paradise as well, because you have the fish out of water character in that, the foreigner who's came to the United States. Yeah, and I believe this was the film after Stranger Than Paradise,
it was.
Right? Oh, okay. So he's riffing on the same themes that he was kind of playing on in the film before. Okay.
I feel like he does that.
Nice.
He usually kind of like piggybacks a little bit off the previous film, or there's like a lot of pairings within.
It's like it's like ruminations on a theme.
Poetry, literature is a huge theme within. He loves characters that are intellectuals, but they don't come across as your typical intellectual. They're people that you think on the surface as you're watching them are kind of lower class, but they're actually highly intelligent, such as the Benini character. He keeps bringing up these really well-known, American authors, and we see that throughout. And it plays into this film a lot because I think, as we've been saying, the other two characters, Jack and Zach, who are native to America, or not native, I should say, they're American to America. Yeah. And they think that they know more than the foreigner, who is Roberto, but he's actually the smarter of the three. And I think he plays a lot with that. So wondering how you feel about just that as a theme that he likes to explore within his films and how it works in this film.
Somebody way more intelligent than me, when I was reading online about this film, they were referencing the Benini character, and he's essentially saying the character arc ultimately of this film is Benini's character essentially teaches these two relatively scumbags in Tom Waits and John Lurie's character how to actually treat a woman properly. Because we have Lurie the pimp, we have Tom Waits, he's in some kind of domestic dispute. I don't know what exactly is going on. But at the end of the day, we have the Benigni character essentially the fool, or we're made to think he's the fool. He's not the fool, but we're made to think he's the fool because he's the fish out of water. And it's him who finds love at the end of the day. And I think that's a very interesting concept for this film. And I think that is kind of Jarmusch's go-to quality about his films, if you want to link it to his whole catalogue of films. I think Tom Waits was once asked about, Jim Jarmusch and his approach and his, his character, so to speak. And he said essentially, look, Jim Jarmusch went grey at 15 years old. So essentially, he was always the outsider. And I think if you look at his films, the identification and the pathos is always on the outsider, whether that's Mystery Train and you have the two Japanese characters, or Patterson, where you have this working class bus driver. You can literally go through his whole catalogue. Broken Flowers, you have this distraught Bill Murray, and it kind of filters through all his kind of work. And I think that's what's interesting. Jim Jarmusch has never tried to fit in with Hollywood. And this was actually, and I think still to this day, I could be wrong. I mean, the facts have maybe changed, but this was his only American funded film, because he didn't like taking funds from American financiers because there was so much baggage associated with that. And I think Jim Jarmusch, in many ways, of course, he's American, but he's very much influenced by European cinema, the European aesthetic. He feels very much indebted to the French New Wave, or even parts of the British kitchen sink movement of the 1960s, or the angry young men writers of the 1950s. He's plumbing a depth of field that you don't typically see in Hollywood films. Sean Baker is doing a terrific job at the moment of exploring that kind of milieu of American society, but in a more neo-realist way, whereas Jim Jarmusch has kind of got this weird magical realism thing going on, even though it's not technically magical realism. So I think there's all these weird ties and threads to Jarmusch, and at the end of the day, he's just singularly Jim Jarmusch.
And if you want to get kind of metaphysical about the whole thing as well, you said Jarmusch had never actually been to New Orleans before making this film, like Benigni had never made an American film before. So Benigni's character being the hero, kind of like Jarmusch being the outsider, he's the only one that's able to see the big picture. He's able to see the way things kind of as they are. So it's almost like Benigni is a kind of self-insert for Jarmusch, because he's looking at this place from the outside. You say kind of North America has this view of the South of America, but he's basically Benigni as the foreigner coming in. He's the only one that's able to see clearly, unlike these two guys who are actually from that place.
That's what I love about Jarmusch and the people he works with, because with Benigni, but also with Müller, of just coming in and being the outsider. If you've seen Paris, Texas, the way he shoots the parts of Texas that no one really wants to go to, he's not trying to make it seem more beautiful, but he's such a great photographer that it makes it look like the most magical place on earth. But I'm sure if you went there, you'd be like, I don't want to be here. I think America is such a fascinating country in the way that it's deeply problematic, but they have such a beautiful landmass that's so different than even Canada. We have a even bigger landmass than America does, and a lot of it is different, but America has a more, a longer history than we do, and it's so separated. We have the United States, and each state is so different versus Canada, where a lot of us are more similar than you can have two states and the cultures are vastly different. So me looking at Louisiana, and we all know New Orleans, but we don't really know the state of Louisiana. We don't know any cities outside of Louisiana, really. And just the way he shoots it as himself being an outsider, and shooting it with someone who is even more an outsider, and having outsider characters. Like, none of those people are from New Orleans who are in this film.
Here's what I find interesting. You're a student of cinematography, so to speak, so you know far more about this kind of topic than us. So I'm curious, like, you've mentioned Robby Müller's ability to, show the beauty in certain hidden elements of American society. But what thread do you see within this film, especially this film, because it's the film we're discussing, and, Paris, Texas, or even beyond that, The American Friend? What's the kind of cinematography tropes you're seeing Robby Müller use?
For me, it's that he likes to paint a picture and be as distant from it. He doesn't like to zoom in on things. He likes to give you the bigger picture. and allows you to focus in on things that you find interesting. He's never trying to be like, this is what you need to pay attention to. He's like, this is what it looks like. You can pay attention to that scrap of wood over there. You can pay attention to that abandoned car in the background because it's all interesting, but I'm not going to force you to look at anything. He's like, I just want to paint it as accurately as possible because when you're using a camera, and he's at this point, they're using film, and it's never going to be the same as your naked eye, obviously, especially because it's black and white in this film specifically. He doesn't want to distort it too much. But I think even just those panning shots at the beginning just paint such a great story as we get into like a sort of abandoned kind of neighborhood where you're like, this is like a certain part of New Orleans City where probably a lot of people live. And then we get into like the touristy neighborhood where when Tom Waits is sitting on the curb, for anyone who's seen films set in New Orleans, like kind of like that, Mardi Gras area, that's where that is, where he's sitting, is like that touristy area. And then you get the swamps and whatnot. And you're like, oh, this is all basically within the same city, but everything looks so different. So just having those tracking shots and just going back and forth, I think is so important.
So after this film, Muller would also shoot Mystery Train, he would shoot Dead Man, he'd shoot Coffee and Cigarettes and Ghost Dog for Jarmusch. Can you see a difference? Because I know he was given carte blanche in here. He was told, it's a fairy tale. That was essentially the only directive. Can you see a difference from film to film in his cinematography? Or is there kind of a repeating pattern with his work with Jarmusch?
The only difference I see as it goes along is when they switch to digital. Like Ghost Dog is very much, you can tell it's digital, but it still has that Mueller vibe to it. At that point, we're getting into, that was 98, 99, and we're getting into that era of, the millennium where a lot of those films look specifically digital in that specific way. Still beautiful, still loves to show cities. I think Mueller's interest, Jarmusch's interest, both of them love to show cities as characters themselves. Whether they explicitly say in Ghost Dog, they never say what city they're in. It's filmed in New Jersey, but they never say it.
I do often wonder if Jarmusch chooses his films depending on what he's listening to at the moment, because I know he's a massive music guy. And I think he did an interview with The Guardian just last year when he was like, yeah, you know what, cinema's dead. I'm just going to make albums with Squirrel, which is his band from now on. He's like, I have no interest anymore. But he's like, we have Memphis, which is a big rock and roll city from back in the 50s, etc. We have New Orleans, a great music place.
Yeah.
I wonder if he's choosing his films based on where he wants to listen to music.
I know that there was supposed to be like a trilogy, like on March. This was the first one of New Orleans being kind of that music city. Then Memphis was a Mystery Train. There was supposed to be another one, I believe, is like
so there was a music link.
Yeah,
was there?
So there was supposed to be another one, I think, in Kansas, but it just didn't work out. So, I mean, America's pretty good with that. Like Tennessee's another really big place for music, country music, and so on. A lot of places in Texas. So hopefully, eventually, he gets around to finishing the trilogy.
Well, I think the lucky thing with Jarmusch is he's pretty much independently financed all of his films. And I believe he said he had final cut on all his films as well, which is very rare. And it's great as well, because I was watching an interview with Jarmusch, and he said, talking about like his formative years and his career as a director, he said this: I'm the navigator of the ship, but I'm not the captain, which I think is great because it shows that to make a film work, you need to have like one clear, singular vision, but you also have to have other people helping. I think a reason a lot of films fail nowadays is because nobody can agree from the outset what the film should be about, what it should be like.
Yeah.
So you hear constantly about rewrites and reshoots, and you get this botched Frankenstein's monster that appears on screen. But with Jarmusch, because the films are smaller, because they're more intimate, and because he has complete creative control, he can make the film he wants to make without compromise. And I think that's what makes his films, like from what I've seen, that's what makes his films so good, because of that singular vision.
Yeah.
Well, it's that room for improvisation, because I believe there's a line in this film by Benigni, and the line was supposed to be, it's a sad and beautiful music, but Benigni misinterpreted that and said sad and beautiful world, which eventually made it into the Tom Waits song for this film called Sad and Beautiful World. So I like that space, that kind of dynamic approach where you're like, okay, let's see what we're working with. It's like kind of what I always assumed John Cassavetes worked with, even though his films were heavily scripted, and people want to say John Cassavetes was this master of improvisation, where Cassavetes is like, no, I wrote everything. It's actually written on the page. But Jim Jarmusch is kind of plumbing that same depth, which I really appreciate.
Yeah. I mean, he's definitely one of as someone who's really into punk culture and has always been like, he's one of my favorite directors for that because he's so in tune to that. But before we move to the last segment, I assume, Liam, you've probably seen this, but I'm actually curious, Wayne, because I feel like this would be your vibe if you do eventually watch it. I feel like you should watch Only Lovers Left Alive. I would be very curious to hear what your thoughts are on that.
Is it because it's very similar to this film, or because it's very different? It has that kind of similar vibe to it.
There's a similarity to it, but I think it's even more just vibes, and less there's a story to it. But
vampires.
Yeah, there's vampires, but they're not the vampire that we're used to.
Detroit. So we're going back to the music cities again.
It's Detroit, it starts off there and then eventually moves to Europe as one does.
To be fair, the Detroit Vampires, that actually sounds like it was a band. So that kind of makes sense musically.
So that's my recommendation for this, for anyone who hasn't seen that, who's listening.
Thank you.
I will try my best to get Wayne to watch Only Lovers Left Alive. But do you know how many times I've recommended films to Wayne? And he's like, look, I'll put it on the list.
There's a list. Everyone has a list.
Like you.
I have a very long list.
He's pedantic. There's always a fucking list. I have no list.
I have a list too.
My wife and I both have lists, and we get films and we kind of collate them, like watch this kind of going forward. So
hey, there's never a shortage of films. So
yeah, that's the thing. There's so many of them.
Well, that was Down by Law to the best of our ability. I hope we sold it for anyone who hasn't watched it, who's listening. I would hope that you've watched it if you're listening. But we're gonna still talk about Jarmusch and this film. I have two more questions for you before I let you go. The very first one, part of the last segment, which is called End Credits, is the starter film. So if someone wants to watch Jarmusch film, has never watched him before, what film are you recommending to them that they start off with, and what's the reason for that recommendation? No wrong answers, just your personal thoughts.
Okay, that's a double-edged sword, because if we are talking Jarmusch of the early 90s, and you are a teenager of the early 90s, I would say this one. I would say this is the most accessible, because it has got humor, it's got pathos, it's got Jim Jarmusch's singular vision. But if you are just getting into Jarmusch now for the first time, I'd probably say Ghost Dog. I think Ghost Dog would probably be the most accessible. It's got a lot of, modern music, which I think a lot of people would appreciate. It's got, it's got the martial arts aspect. Everybody's into martial art films now. It's like the whole Shaw Brothers thing revisited. And it has a point. So I think kind of that would be the most accessible.
Okay.
So in totality, I'd say Ghost Dog.
Okay. That's interesting. What about you, Wayne?
The thing is, I have obviously a lot less experience with Jarmusch than the two of you two, but from all of that I've seen and all that I've read, this is because this took place in Jarmusch's early years. So obviously this is when he's just kind of finding his feet, he's refining his style, he's getting to experiment, he's getting to play around. And this seems like a kind of film where pieces are kind of starting to fall into place because he's getting the music, he's getting the vibe, he's getting the pacing, the camera work, the framing, working with Robby Müller and getting kind of comfortable with him. So again, my limited experience, I think this would be a good film to introduce someone to Jarmusch, just because of its tone, because of its vibe, its feel, its atmosphere, and because there is a lot of great stuff in this film to recommend. And I think it does kind of work as an introduction to the man and his filmography.
Yeah, that's interesting, because I am covering Ghost Dog in this, and rewatching it, I can totally understand how it would appeal. Like, I think it would be a good starter. My go-to is always Down by Law, because as I'm being biased because it's my favorite one. So I always tell people, you start off here. Yeah, just start off here.
It's objectively the best. It's objectively the best.
It's the one that's like, I'm so happy to have people watch off the bat, and then they can go back and watch Stranger the Paradise and Permanent Vacation, and then go forward, or they can just go forward and eventually move their way back. But I think this one really tells you his interesting characters and what he likes, and just like visually, it's just so beautiful. So
it sums up his whole approach to film, doesn't it?
I think so.
this
Yeah.
film.
And he
Yeah.
does it in other films too, but as you get more experience in life and just in your career, things start to look different. But I think this is just the great starting off point, and you can go from. And it's a tight film. It's like an hour and 40 something.
One critic said it was over long. I was like, no, what could you drop from this film to make it, speedier?
Yeah.
I don't think there's anything.
No, I think it's the right length for the story it's telling.
Unless we're going to do something like cut 2 seconds from each scene or something like that, which is such an inconsequential amount of time anyway. What's even the point?
Exactly. That's the only way you would be able to do it. It just like kind of slightly cut down some scenes, but like no, even like the scene where Roberto and Nicolette are dancing, and it kind of goes on for longer than you expect because it goes for the length of the song, where most films would cut it like in between. I love that it does the whole song because it's just so beautiful to watch them fall in love and the looks they're giving each other.
I like that too.
It's great. But second and last question of the show is a double bill.
Okay.
So you can give me more than one film, but if you were making a double bill or a triple bill or whatnot with Down by Law, what film or films would you pair this one with?
I'm going to go for another road movie. We said this is a road movie. Look, it's a road movie, okay? So I'm going to go back to 1971, Monty Hellman, Two Lane Black. The discovery of oneself when you're, on the open vistas of the United States landscape. That is my reason, and I think it would pair absolutely terrifically with Monty Hellman's Two Lane Blacktop.
Nice.
And we've got two musicians in that film. Also, we have Dennis Wilson and we have James Taylor, who give great performances. We also have Warren Oates, so we have there's a symbiotic relationship there. We've got two musicians and an accomplished actor, as we do in Down by Law. And I think it would make an absolutely terrific pairing, and it kind of gives a through away from the new Hollywood system to the I suppose the next important American cultural movement, which is the 80s underground independent.
How about you, Wayne?
Well, actually, when I was thinking about it, there was actually two films that came to mind. The first one that sprung up, I don't know if this is kind of an odd choice, but the original Clerks, the Kevin Smith movie, because similar aesthetic, it's black and white. It's not really about the story. It's more of a character study, and it has that kind of laid back feel as if you're just hanging out with friends. And hanging out with friends is why I thought of another film, which was Dazed and Confused, because that's a similar thing. Tarantino, I think, said it's one of the best just kind of hangout movies ever. The kind of movie you can just kick back, like you're spending time with friends and acquaintances, how it has that laid back feel. It's not in any hurry to go anywhere. It shows a lot of stuff you could maybe cut, but because it's all character stuff, it's dialogue driven, there's lots of contemplative moments. Those are the two films I think I would kind of pair it up.
Those are all interesting. There's no wrong answer to this. It's more so what area, film, or what vibe you're going for in that specific night. But I love all of those pairings. The one that came to mind for some reason, which is kind of similar, not necessarily similar to Two Lane Blacktop, but has a actor who's also in both. I thought of Straight Time, which is an Uli Grossbard film starring Dustin Hoffman and Harry Dean Stanton, who's also in Two Lane Blacktop. And this is a crime film. It's kind of a noir, and it's kind of a buddy film. And I think this is very much a buddy film also. And it's not so much a road film, but there's a crime aspect and them just playing off each other's personalities and figuring out how to live life within that crime life and get money and get out of situations. So very good precursor to what they were doing in the 80s is the 70s film, late 70s. And I think it's great. It's one of my favorite films, which I've covered on the podcast before, but it's an underseen, and I think it would make a great pairing.
Correct me if I'm wrong, but I believe Straight Time's based on the Eddie Bunker memoir.
It is.
Or story. Yep. Yeah. Who was one of the Mr. Colors in Reservoir Dogs, Tarantino's film.
He was.
Yeah. That's a good film. Yeah.
It is.
I can see that. That makes thematic sense.
Yeah, I think sometimes with American films, you kind of want to pair it with another very American film, but like of a different area of America that just kind of shows exactly what they're doing in that specific state. Like Straight Time is very California. And Clerks, I think, is New Jersey, is where it's shot.
If you were to pair this film with another Robby Müller film, which would you choose? And I'm going to exclude, because I think everybody goes for Paris, Texas. If you couldn't choose Paris, Texas, which one would you choose?
The first one that came to mind was The American Friend for some reason. when I was thinking of this.
Great film. Dennis Hopper.
Yeah. Of just having that one outsider in a foreign land to them. Even Mueller is not from where it was filmed. It's filmed in different countries, but just having those outsiders within this system and trying to operate within a crime life and trying to figure out. So I think they're very different, but I think it would show what he's able to do in color and in black and white, and how he's able to capture characters and actors.
And one of the best versions of a Ripley story, right?
I mean, I think so,
I think
for sure. But
yeah, I think so as well.
I think that we've covered Down by Law. I am so happy to have been able to discuss this film, because I would have been really sad to not talk about my favorite Jarmusch film in this series.
Yeah, you came to us, you were like, do you have a Jarmusch film you want to choose? I was like, look, I don't know if it's chosen yet, but my favorite is Down by Law. And by happenstance, it had not been chosen. And I had no idea at the time it was also your favorite.
Yeah, no, I try not to give people too much so that they feel like they need to pick that if it's my favorite. So I try not to say anything. But when it was picked, I was like, all right, sweet. I do get to talk about my favorite. It doesn't always happen. But thank you both for coming on.
You're welcome.
Anyone who's been inspired to listen to their podcast in Film We Trust, all those links will be in the show notes. Please give it a listen. I highly recommend on my end. They're covering some great films. Seeing Faces in Movies is an official podcast of the Royal Film Club. It's hosted and edited by Felicia with intro music by Lamar Walker. If you like what you heard, let us know at seeingfacesinmovies.com or send us an email at seeingfacesinmovies@gmail.com. And while you're at it, please subscribe and rate the show wherever you listen to your podcast. And thanks for joining us for our Jim Jarmusch series.